the chill of an early Maine autumn bit at Art Finch's knees, a familiar ache that whispered of the long winter ahead. At 62, after 2 decades of navigating life as a single father, Art had finally told his son, Ethan, that he was going to marry again. Ethan had smiled then, a tight, polite curve of his lips, and said, "That's wonderful, Dad. But before you walk down the aisle, how about we transfer your home, bank accounts, and investments into a family trust for us?" Just then, the doorbell had chimed, but Art was getting ahead of himself. That Tuesday had begun much like any other in Portsmouth Bay, a picturesque coastal town where the air always carried the tang of salt and pine. The sky was a muted gray, fallen leaves clung wetly to the flagstone path leading to his front door, and the persistent twinge in his right knee was a constant reminder of approaching cold. Art had spent the better part of the afternoon simmering a rich beef stew in the heavy blue Dutch oven his late wife, Clara, used to keep nestled at the back of the stove. Ethan, even at 38, still loved that stew, just as he had as a boy, carefully lining up the bright orange carrot chunks around the rim of his bowl like tiny edible soldiers. He'd still ask for a second helping, Art knew. To complete the meal, Art had picked up a crusty sourdough loaf from the bakery near the historic lighthouse and a warm apple pie he'd proudly and falsely claimed as his own creation. Eleanor had helped him select the perfect bottle of dry red, though she wouldn't be joining them. He wanted to share the news of his engagement privately with Ethan and Lila, father to son. It still meant something, that sacred bond. At precisely 6:10, Ethan's sleek, black SUV crunched onto the gravel drive. He left the headlights blazing, casting stark shadows against the house, while Lila scrolled through something on her phone. Through the front window, Art could see her lips moving silently as she read. When they finally stepped inside, Ethan handed Art a bottle of aged, single malt scotch. Early Christmas, he'd quipped, though it was only October. Gives you time to practice. That was Ethan, a flash of humor, a way of deflecting whenever the atmosphere grew too serious. Lila offered Art a peck on the cheek and placed her expensive leather handbag on the dining chair Clara had always occupied. Art noticed, and then felt a pang of foolishness for noticing. Clara had been gone 21 years. A chair couldn't belong to a woman forever departed. Yet, he still moved the bag to an empty seat when Lila went to wash her hands. Dinner started off pleasantly enough. Ethan grumbled about the new ferry terminal construction that clogged the main road into town. Lila recounted how their eldest son, Owen, had landed a speaking role in his school's Founders' Day pageant. Art had asked if Owen needed help memorizing his lines. "He's got it," Ethan had assured him. "Kid remembers everything." Art had smiled. Must get that from his mother. Lila offered a polite, somewhat strained laugh. The television in the living room played muted, displaying a weather map with a swirling blue line tracking across the New England coast. The hearth fire Art had lit earlier crackled softly. For a few minutes, he allowed himself to believe his apprehension had been for naught. Then Art placed his spoon down. "I have some news I'd like to share." Ethan looked up, a glint in his eye. "Finally bought that sailboat, Dad?" "No, you should. You've been talking about it for 10 years. I asked Eleanor to marry me." The room went still. Not just quiet, but profoundly silent, so much so that Art heard the refrigerator's compressor hum to life in the kitchen. Lila glanced at Ethan before turning her gaze to Art. Ethan blinked once, then offered that same tight smile. "Well, congratulations," he said. Art waited. Ethan reached across the table and shook Art's hand, the gesture strangely formal, almost contractual. "When did this happen?" Lila asked, her voice softer than usual. "Saturday. We walked along the cliffs near the old fort, then had dinner at the sea shanty." Art felt a warmth spread through him. "And she said yes." "Wonderful," Lila said, her tone warm. But her fingers had ceased their idle circling of her wine-glass stem. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "When's the wedding?" "Probably April. A small ceremony at the old church by the harbor. Nothing elaborate." Art paused, sensing the shift in the air. "Have you two discussed a prenuptial agreement?" The question hung there. Not a congratulation, not an inquiry about his happiness or where they might live. A prenuptial agreement. Art found his jaw tightening. "We've already begun discussing it." Lila carefully folded her napkin. Good. Second marriages can be complicated. She continued, her gaze direct, especially regarding assets. And retirement accounts beneficiaries, long-term care. Ethan chimed in, his voice taking on a familiar, slightly urgent edge. What Lila means is, we just want to protect you, Dad. Protect him? From Eleanor? From complications? Art looked from one to the other. Eleanor had never asked him for a cent. On their first trip together, she'd insisted on paying for her own half of the cabin. She owned a charming cottage overlooking the bay, drove a perfectly reliable 7-year-old sedan, and still clipped coupons even with a comfortable pension from her years as a librarian. What exactly are you worried about? Art asked, his voice low. Lyle's expression softened, almost as if she were addressing one of her own children. No one thinks Eleanor is a bad person, Dad, but people change when money is involved. What people? Art pressed. She hesitated. Ethan interjected. Dad, you've worked your entire life for what you have. Mom did too. That line, Art thought, probably stung more than Ethan intended. Clara had worked as a dental hygienist for 14 years before she fell ill. After she was gone, Art had worked night shifts at the shipyard, weekends, every holiday shift he could get. He'd refinanced the house so Ethan could stay in university. He'd skipped vacations so Ethan wouldn't graduate burdened with debt. He didn't need his son reminding him who had built his life. Leela reached down beside her chair and pulled out a slim legal binder, placing it on the table with a soft thud. We spoke to someone about setting up a family trust, she said, her voice smooth, just as a precaution. I didn't touch it, Ethan said quickly. Lila opened the binder and slid a few pages across the table towards Art. At first, the words blurred, not because he couldn't read, but because he didn't want to comprehend what he was seeing. A draft of instructions. Trustee, Ethan Finch, assets to be transferred, Art's home, brokerage accounts, certificates of deposit, and other investment properties. Monthly distributions to be determined by the trustee. Art looked at his son. You want me to give you control of my money? I wouldn't put it like that, Dad. It's written right here. You'd still have access. Access? Ethan rubbed his forehead, a gesture of exasperation. Dad, come on, don't make this complicated. I didn't bring the papers to dinner. You can still marry Eleanor, Lila said gently, a placating tone in her voice. No one's trying to stop you. Ethan nodded. Marry her if you want, but before the wedding, transfer the house, the accounts, and the investments into the trust, and I'll manage it for the family. Art stared at him, at the face that had once been round and freckled. He could still picture him at 8, asleep on the living room sofa, his baseball mitt clutched in his hand, waiting for Art to come home from a late shift. He'd carried him upstairs without waking him. Now he sat across from Art, calculating what Art would be allowed to keep. Have you already decided how long I'll live? Art asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not fair, Dad. No, because this feels less like you're planning my inheritance and more like you're carving up my life while I'm still sitting here. We're trying to protect the grandchildren, Lila said, her voice rising slightly. From what? College debt, or from the possibility that I might spend my own money before I die. Ethan pushed his chair back slightly. You're twisting things. No, I'm finally hearing them clearly. He glanced towards the hallway. That's when the doorbell chimed. Once, then again. Art slowly rose, his knees stiff with the sudden chill of the conversation. Through the sidelight beside the door, he saw a man in a dark jacket holding a large envelope. Mr. Arthur Finch? The man asked when Art opened it. Yes, I'm here to serve you with some papers from the Hamilton County Superior Court. Art's stomach clenched. He signed for the packet and carried it back to the dining room. Ethan's face was ashen. Lila's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Art opened to the first page. A verified petition for appointment of guardian for an alleged incapacitated adult. His name was listed below, then Ethan's. Art looked at the filing date, 6 days prior. You filed this last Wednesday, Art said, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan swallowed hard. Dad, we were hoping you'd cooperate. The packet on the table wasn't an offer. Dinner hadn't been a conversation. It had been their final attempt to get him to surrender willingly. Art looked at the son he had raised alone for 21 years. You filed this before I even told you the wedding date. Ethan's eyes dropped to the table. We knew you wouldn't listen. That was the moment Art understood. They hadn't come to save him from Eleanor. They had come to take his money. The process server was barely backing out of Art's driveway when Ethan began to speak. Art stood up. Dad, read everything first before you panic. Art looked at him. Panic? You know what your parents look like? No, Art said softly. I don't think you do. Lila reached for the binder she'd brought. A petition doesn't mean someone thinks you're incapacitated, Dad. It simply asks the court to review the situation. Wonderful. You're asking a judge to decide if I can manage my own life. We're asking for protection. For whom? Neither of them answered. The beef stew sat untouched, slowly cooling between them. The scent of onions and thyme filled the room, but suddenly Art couldn't imagine eating another bite. Ethan finally spoke. We didn't want it to come to this. Then why did you file 6 days before sitting down at my table? His shoulders slumped. We wanted to give you one last chance. One last chance to do what? To make the right decision. Art couldn't help but let out a bitter, low laugh. You mean, your decision? Lila looked genuinely distressed. Arthur, please don't think of us as your adversaries. My adversaries probably wouldn't. Art let the sentence trail off, waiting until dessert was served. Ethan rubbed his hands over his face. You're making this sound terrible. No, son, it is terrible. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weather forecast continued to blink silently on the television. Finally, Ethan picked up his keys. We'll let the lawyers explain everything. Then they left. Art watched their SUV disappear down the street without a backward glance. No, Art didn't sleep much that night. The house suddenly felt strangely loud. The refrigerator hummed. The hearth fire clicked on every 20 minutes. A branch scraped against the bedroom window whenever the wind picked up. Around 1:30, he gave up pretending. He carried the lawsuit into the kitchen, poured himself a mug of truly awful coffee, and began to read every page. The language was polite, cold, dry. It didn't call him a bad father. It simply described him as a man of questionable judgment. One paragraph suggested he'd forgotten where he'd parked his truck after Owen's soccer game. That part was technically true, except it omitted the fact that he'd parked 2 blocks away because the lot was full. Another section said he'd missed a dental appointment, also true because he'd written Thursday instead of Wednesday in his calendar. There was a section about the necklace he'd bought Eleanor for their anniversary, $2,100. The petition described it as an unusual luxury purchase, inconsistent with Mr. Finch's prior financial habits. Art almost laughed. He'd spent more than that repairing Ethan's transmission 3 years earlier. No one had questioned his judgment then. The last page that stopped Art's reading involved his doctor. Apparently, he had mentioned occasional forgetfulness during his annual physical. He'd also complained of restless sleep after changing his blood pressure medication. Dr. Albright had adjusted the dosage. That was it. No dementia, no Alzheimer's, no cognitive decline diagnosis. Yet it was rewritten to sound like the beginning of mental decline. Art leaned back in his chair. The coffee was cold. He suddenly understood something he hadn't before. You didn't have to be helpless to feel helpless. Sometimes all it took was seeing your name described as if someone else had already decided who you were. Precisely at 8 the next morning, Art called Julian Vance. He'd known Julian for nearly 30 years. Julian had handled Clara's estate. He'd helped Art refinance the house after her death. He picked up on the second ring. Good morning, Julian. Art, what's up? I need your help. His voice instantly changed. What happened? Ethan filed for guardianship. Silence. Then get to my office. Julian's office overlooked the courthouse square in Portsmouth Bay. Still the same brick building. Still the same wooden bookshelves. Still the same bowl of peppermints that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. He read the petition without interruption. When he finished, he folded his reading glasses. They're asking for guardianship of both your person and your estate. What exactly does that mean? It means they want a judge to decide if you're capable of making your own decisions. Can they actually do this? They can ask. And asking isn't winning. That helped Art's anxiety a little. Julian leaned forward. Art, listen carefully. Art nodded. The court doesn't expect 62-year-olds to remember every appointment or never misplace their keys. Then why does this feel so terrifying? Because it is. Julian didn't sugarcoat it. A guardianship petition was serious, but serious didn't mean accurate. He tapped a page. The issue isn't whether you ever forget something. The issue is whether you understand your assets, your finances, your relationships, and the consequences of your decisions. Art let out a slow breath. I understand. I know you do. Julian paused. But now we have to prove it. Before Art left, Julian gave him 3 instructions. First, he held up a finger. Don't move money around just because you're angry. I wasn't planning on it. Good. Second, no emotional texts. Art gave a wry laugh. I've already deleted 3 drafts. Wise decision. And third, don't argue with Ethan. That might be the hardest thing. Julian nodded. Anything you say can become evidence. That evening, Eleanor came over, bringing chicken noodle soup. I figured you probably haven't eaten. He'd had toast at 4. She knew him too well. They sat on the back porch, wrapped in light jackets while the sun dipped behind the maple trees. Art handed her the guardianship petition. She read every page. When she got to the part that implied she was manipulating his finances, tears welled in her eyes. I'm so sorry. You didn't write it, but I'm why they did this. No. Yes. She looked down at the papers. If we weren't getting married, none of this would be happening. Art reached out to take her hand. She gently pulled it back. Maybe we should put things on hold. Art stared at her. For how long? I don't know. A year, maybe. What if they object again? She didn't answer. 2 years, nothing would change. 5 years? Her eyes glistened. I don't want to be the reason you lose your son. Those words hurt Art more than Ethan's petition, because she meant them. He walked to the porch railing. Across the yard was the oak tree Clara, and he had planted when Ethan graduated from high school. For a moment, Art almost heard Clara's laugh carried on the wind. Not literally, just the memory. The kind that washes over you when you're lonely. Before she died, they had talked about everything. Bills, Ethan, the house, even the possibility that he might one day meet someone else. She'd squeezed his hand and whispered, "Don't spend the rest of your life sitting in an empty house because of me." He'd promised then, and he'd broken that promise for 21 years. Art turned back to Eleanor. Well, this isn't your fault. She looked at him intently. Are you sure? No. Art gave a sad laugh. It's my fault, she frowned. Art had spent 21 years believing that whenever Ethan was in trouble, it was Art's job to rescue him. He looked down at his hands. Maybe he'd forgotten that raising a man wasn't the same as saving him forever. Eleanor walked over and took his hand. Both of them were silent for a while. Sometimes silence spoke truths better than words. Just before 9 that night, Art's phone rang. Julian, they've requested an emergency hearing. Already. They're asking for temporary control of some financial decisions until the court reviews the case. Art closed his eyes. What do I do? You continue to live your life exactly as you have been. And Art, Julian answered without hesitation. From now on, assume that every word you say can be repeated in a courtroom. After hanging up, Art stood alone on the porch. The lights from inside cast a soft glow, and the low hum of conversation drifted through the backyard window. For the first time since Clara died, Art realized something. He wasn't afraid of growing old. He was afraid that the people he loved most had decided he was no longer allowed to choose how he lived the rest of his years. The following Monday, Art sat in a small clinic in Carmel, answering questions he never imagined he'd have to answer. What year is it? 2026. Who is the current governor of Maine? He answered without hesitation. The doctor smiled politely and continued. Can you tell me what medications you take? He listed each one: blood pressure, cholesterol, vitamin D, a prescription anti-inflammatory for his knee. Then came the questions that felt less like a medical exam, and more like someone was evaluating whether he was still worthy of being treated like an adult. If someone offered to buy your house tomorrow for half its value, what would you do? I'd tell them to leave. She smiled. What if you were to get married without discussing your assets? I'd probably have a few uncomfortable evenings talking to my lawyer. Art managed a small laugh. By the time the assessment ended, nearly 2 hours had passed. The doctor shook his hand. Mr. Finch, Thank you for your patience. Art thanked her, climbed into his pickup truck, closed the door, and sat there for nearly 5 minutes. He didn't feel relieved. He felt exhausted. It wasn't the questions that had bothered him. It was the realization of how easily ordinary moments, like forgetting his keys, missing an appointment, buying an expensive necklace, could be quickly compiled and twisted into a narrative of a man losing his mind. Aging suddenly felt different. Not because he feared illness, but because he finally understood how easily others could describe his life for him. 3 days later, Art sat across from Julian Vance again. His conference table was covered with document bins. So, Julian said, pushing a bin towards Art, let's build your story together. He handed Art a stack of yellow legal pads. We're going to list every single time you've helped Ethan financially. Art frowned. All of them? That'll take all day. Julian gave a wry chuckle. I cleared my afternoon. They started with the easy ones. Ethan's first house, the down payment, then the business loan, then 6 months of mortgage payments when the business faltered, then help with Owen's preschool tuition, then covering medical bills after their second child was born. The list grew. Every time Art remembered another check, another transfer, another emergency, Julian quietly added another line. Around lunchtime, he leaned back in his chair. You know what's interesting? What? You never asked for anything back. He's my son. Julian nodded. Yes, and then he looked at you, and at some point he stopped feeling like your son and started acting like your client. That line stuck with Art because it stung, mostly because it wasn't entirely untrue. By late afternoon, they were finished. Julian tallied everything. $468,230. Art stared at the number. Honestly, I didn't think it was that much. Most parents don't. Art gave a soft laugh. The funny thing is, I don't regret helping him. I know. I regret teaching him that help would always come. Julian closed the file. That difference is important. Eleanor arrived just before 5, carrying another binder. This is mine. She placed it on the conference table. Inside were documents Art had never asked to see. Pension statements, property records, insurance information, a draft of a prenuptial agreement. Julian reviewed everything carefully. Finally, he looked at Art. Art, do you know Eleanor owns her cottage outright? No. Eleanor shrugged. I paid it off 4 years ago. And your pension? She smiled. 36 years with the library system. Julian nodded approvingly. This changes the picture. Eleanor shook her head. No, it doesn't. She looked at both of them. I don't want it to change. Julian folded the prenuptial agreement. This doesn't prove you're not influencing Art. Eleanor looked frustrated, but it proves something almost as important. What? You don't need his money. Eleanor turned to Art. I never wanted your money. I know. I just wanted someone to complain about my knees with. That made Art laugh. And someone who likes old movies? I do like old movies. And someone who doesn't think dinner at 4:30 is strange. Not strange at all. See, for the first time in almost a week, they had shared a genuine laugh, just for a minute. It felt wonderful. The following Friday, Ethan called Art. Hey Dad, how are you doing? Tired. He hesitated. Leela and I were wondering if you'd meet with us. Why? So we can get some things straightened out. Art almost said no. Instead, he remembered Julian's advice. Where? Our lawyer's office. Art agreed. The office was in a newer building just outside Portsmouth. Bright lobby. Fresh coffee. Too much glass. Lila greeted Art as if nothing unusual had happened. Thanks for coming, Dad. Ethan wouldn't meet Art's gaze. Their lawyer spoke first. We believe there's still an opportunity for the family to avoid unnecessary litigation. Art nodded. He opened a file. We've revised our proposal. Lila smiled hopefully. If you establish a trust now, Ethan could be the trustee. What's the change? You'd still live in your current home, of course, she hesitated. Yes, their lawyer continued. You'd receive regular distributions for living expenses. Who decides how much? Ethan answered. We would. Based on what? We've reviewed your monthly spending. He pushed a spreadsheet across the table. Food, utilities, fuel, church contributions, dining out, everything. Someone had estimated how much money Art was allowed to spend each month. Art stared at the page. You've budgeted my life. Lila spoke softly. We're trying to simplify things. For whom? For everyone. Art looked down again. There was even a section labeled Future Housing Options. One line caught his eye. Potential sale value. Portsmouth Bay resident. Art looked up. You've already discussed selling my house. Lila answered too quickly. No. Art tapped the paper. Then why is there an estimated sale value? She blinked. It's just preliminary planning. Planning for what? In case you eventually wanted a smaller home. I never said I wanted a smaller home. Ethan interjected. We're just thinking ahead, Dad. Art slowly closed the file. You've thought ahead a great deal. No one answered. The meeting concluded politely, almost awkwardly. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. But as Art walked towards the parking lot, Julian caught up to him. Walk with me. So, what do you think? He gave a wry smile. I think Lila made only one mistake. What mistake? She admitted to having already started planning for life after you lost control of your assets. Art stopped walking. You really think that's important? I think the judge notices timing. The next morning, Julian called before 8. I just received their amended petition. Now what? They're asking the court to temporarily restrict major financial transactions. Why? They claim you're likely to transfer assets before the wedding. Art let out a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because he finally understood. This had never truly been about whether he could manage his money. It was about ensuring he couldn't manage it without their permission. Julian's voice remained calm. They've finally stopped pretending this is just about your health. Art looked out his kitchen window at the backyard, where the leaves had begun to drift across the lawn. For the first time since all this began, he no longer wondered if his son had betrayed him. He knew he had. The only question left was whether the court would see it too. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Art arrived at the Hamilton County Justice Center 45 minutes early. That was nothing new for him. 38 years at the shipyard had trained him to believe that if you weren't 15 minutes early, you were late. Julian was already there, sitting on a wooden bench outside the courtroom with a legal pad resting on his knee. He looked up as Art approached. Get any sleep? A little, more than most people before a trial. He handed Art a paper cup of coffee. It's terrible. Art took a sip. Yes, but it's hot. That's the best thing you can say about courthouse coffee. For a moment, both of them smiled. It helped. Not because the joke was funny, but because it reminded Art that he was still allowed to feel like a normal person. A few minutes later, Eleanor arrived. She wore a navy dress and a light gray cardigan, not expensive, not flashy. She sat beside Art without a word and took his hand. Her hand was cold. Art's probably was too. Across the hallway, Ethan and Lila walked in with their lawyer. Ethan glanced at Art, then almost immediately looked away. Lila offered a small, polite nod. It felt formal, as if they were colleagues waiting for a meeting rather than family members, waiting to decide whether Art could still be trusted to manage his own life. The courtroom doors opened. Guardianship docket, the court clerk announced. They filed inside. The room wasn't large. A few rows of wooden benches, an American flag, the main state flag, a judge's bench polished smooth by decades of use. No reporters, no television cameras, no noisy spectators. Just families bringing their private grief into a public room. Judge Eleanor Vance entered precisely on time. Everyone rose. After a few customary formalities, their case was called. The lawyer representing Ethan began first. He spoke calmly, respectfully. He stressed that no one was accusing Art of being a bad person. This petition, he said, was simply to ensure Mr. Finch was protected during a significant period of change in his life. He referenced Art's upcoming wedding, the expensive necklace, the missed dental appointment, the medication adjustment, the forgotten truck keys. Each event sounded harmless in isolation. Together, they were presented as a pattern. It was a strange experience to listen to someone else summarize your life, especially when every ordinary mistake became evidence. Then Julian stood. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to the podium and said, Your Honor, age does not make one incompetent. He paused. It just makes one look older. He submitted the independent cognitive assessment. The judge read it in silence for several minutes. She looked up. Mr. Finch. Yes, Your Honor. Please approach. Art walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she asked the first question herself. Mr. Finch, can you describe your current sources of income? Art explained his shipyard pension, his retirement investments, Social Security, and a small consulting job he occasionally took for an old logistics company. She nodded. And who manages those funds? I do. Have you ever asked Eleanor Reed to manage your finances? No. Has she ever asked? Never. Ethan's lawyer approached. Mr. Finch, did you purchase a necklace for Ms. Reed costing approximately $2,100? I did. Why? Because I love her. A few soft smiles rippled through the room. The lawyer continued, would you agree that gift was more expensive than gifts you had purchased previously? Yes. Why the change? Art shrugged. Because I'm 62. The lawyer's brow furrowed slightly. Art continued. I spent 21 years putting other people first. I finally met someone worth celebrating. A silence settled over the room. The lawyer pivoted. Have you ever forgotten an appointment? Yes. Have you misplaced your truck keys? Yes. You were disoriented after a medication change for approximately 30 minutes. So, you admit you have memory issues? No. Art looked him straight in the eye. I admit I'm getting older. Then he added, if forgetting where I parked one afternoon means I lose the right to make my own decisions, then, he paused. Probably half the people at the grocery store should be standing up here beside me. A few muffled laughs broke out in the courtroom. Even Judge Vance smiled for a moment. Your Honor. Julian began his cross-examination. Mr. Finch, why did you agree to a prenuptial agreement? Because Eleanor suggested it. Why? So my assets remained mine, and hers remained hers. Did she ask for ownership of your home? No. Any investment accounts? No. Any retirement funds? No. Julian held up the signed draft. This agreement states each party waives all claims to the other's premarital assets. The judge reviewed it carefully. Ethan's lawyer objected that the agreement was not yet finalized. Julian nodded. That is true, Your Honor. We offer it merely to demonstrate Mr. Finch's intent and Ms. Reed's lack of financial motivation. The judge allowed it into evidence. Then came the part Art had dreaded most. Julian placed a thick binder on the witness stand. The court has heard much testimony suggesting Mr. Finch is financially vulnerable. He opened the binder. I'd like to discuss another financial relationship. He projected a spreadsheet onto the courtroom screen, line by line. March 2010. Down payment assistance, $38,000. June 2014. Business loan, $67,000. Mortgage assistance, car repairs, medical bills, tax payments, educational expenses. The list went on. Almost every item had supporting bank records, emails, canceled checks, text messages. The total appeared at the bottom, $468,230. Julian looked towards Ethan. Did your father voluntarily provide these funds? Ethan answered softly. Yes. Did you promise to repay them many times? Yes. Have you repaid the majority of these funds? Ethan swallowed. No. Julian nodded once. No further questions. The judge had no intention of embarrassing Ethan. Instead, she asked, Mr. Ethan Finch? Ethan looked up. When did you first ask your father to transfer his assets into a trust under your management? Ethan hesitated. A few days before dinner. And when was this petition filed? He glanced towards his lawyer. The judge repeated the question. 6 days before dinner, Ethan admitted, and the courtroom grew very quiet. Judge Vance folded her hands. So, before speaking to your father, you filed a petition asking the court to appoint a guardian for him? Yes. Has any doctor diagnosed your father with dementia? No. Alzheimer's? No. Any condition that prevents him from understanding his finances? No. The judge looked down at the petition. Has Mr. Finch failed to pay his taxes? No. Lost a significant amount of money to fraud? No. Failed to understand the nature of his assets? No. She looked straight at Ethan. So what precisely changed? Ethan opened his mouth. No words came out. Julian called one final witness, a local real estate agent. She testified that Lila had contacted her several weeks prior, asking for a market value estimate on Art's home. Lila immediately explained that it was just preliminary planning. The judge accepted the explanation without censure. But then she asked a simple question. Mrs. Finch, did your father-in-law ever tell you he wanted to sell that home? Lila dropped her head. No. Then why begin discussing its value before he had made that decision? Lila could not answer. She didn't need to. Her silence answered for her. Judge Vance recessed for 20 minutes. They were the longest 20 minutes of Art's life. When she returned, she spoke calmly. The court finds insufficient evidence to demonstrate Mr. Arthur Finch is incapacitated in managing his personal or financial affairs. She paused. The request for temporary guardianship is denied. Another pause. The petition is dismissed. Art closed his eyes. Not because he had won, but because for the first time in weeks, he could finally breathe. Outside the courtroom, Ethan caught up to Art before he reached the elevator. "Dad," Art turned around. "We were just so scared." Art looked at him for a few seconds. Then he said softly, "You were scared I'd spend my own money." Ethan's shoulders slumped. Art continued, "You never stopped to ask yourself if by treating me as if I couldn't be trusted with my own life, you were losing yourself." "Dad." Ethan tried again to speak. Art gently raised a hand. "Not today." Eleanor took Art's arm. They walked together towards the courthouse doors. The November air was colder than when they'd entered, but somehow Art felt lighter. The wedding had been scheduled for the week after the hearing. Instead, Eleanor and Art postponed it by 6 weeks. Not because either of them had changed their minds, but because Art needed time to remember that his life was still his own. For nearly a month, every time the phone rang, Art expected another legal notice. Every trip to the mailbox made his stomach clench. He'd never imagined that protecting his right to remarry would be more exhausting than 38 years of lifting boxes before dawn. Eleanor never pushed. Some evenings, she'd just stop by with a book. Other days, they'd walk the trails at Potbridge Park without talking much. That silence was different now. Comfortable. Earned. One Saturday, she looked at him and smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "You still apologize every time your knee slows you down." "I do. You apologized 3 times on this walk alone." Art laughed. "Well, you did have to wait for me." She squeezed his arm. "Art, I plan on spending the rest of my life with you." She looked down at his knee. "I don't expect you to win a marathon." For the first time in weeks, Art's laugh was unforced. They married on a brisk December afternoon in a small church in Portsmouth. Nothing lavish. About 30 guests. Julian came with his wife. A few retired friends from the shipyard were there. Eleanor's sister brought homemade cookies for the reception. Instead of a ballroom, they used the fellowship hall. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a simple white sheet cake with buttercream frosting. No DJ, just a playlist of old songs playing through the church speakers. Midway through dinner, Eleanor leaned over and whispered, "You know what? What? This is exactly the wedding I always wanted." Art looked around the room. People chatted. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Someone laughed too loudly near the dessert table. No one cared about assets. No one cared about inheritance. For a few hours, they were simply 2 older people starting a new chapter, and that was enough. Ethan wasn't there. Art had thought about him many times that day. More than once, Art reached for his phone. More than once, he put it back in his pocket. Love didn't disappear just because someone hurt you. But forgiveness didn't operate on a timeline either. The following week, Julian called Art back to his office. "One last thing," he said, referring to Art's estate plan. This time, Art didn't react out of anger. That was important. Julian spread the documents across the conference table. "What do you want your assets to accomplish?" The question surprised Art. Not who got what, but what he wanted it to accomplish. Art thought for a long time. Finally, he answered, "I want to help people." Julian waited. "I want Eleanor to be protected if I die first." He nodded and made a note. "I want my grandchildren to have opportunities." Another note. "But I don't want money to become another reason people stop taking responsibility for their own lives." Julian looked up. "So, what are you thinking?" "I don't want Ethan managing anything. That can be arranged. I don't want Eleanor to worry about where she'll live. We'll give her the right to reside in the house for the rest of her life if she chooses." Art nodded. "And after that, the house can be sold. And the proceeds?" Art smiled. "Put them into a trust for the grandchildren. With conditions, yes, like education, medical needs, a future first home. But no one, not even Ethan, is allowed to treat it like an ATM." Julian smiled. "I like that. I do too." When everything was complete, Art signed the papers. He never felt like he was punishing his son. He was simply drawing boundaries he should have drawn years ago. The hardest boundary wasn't changing his will. It was changing his habits. About 6 weeks later, Ethan called. Dad. His voice sounded different, somehow smaller. Art's mind raced. For 21 years, Art knew exactly what would happen next. He'd ask how much. Ethan would apologize. Art would write a check. Instead, Art asked, did you get a quote? About 3,200. Estimate, silence. Then Ethan said softly, yeah. More silence. Finally, he asked, can you lend me the money? Art closed his eyes. His first instinct was the old one. Help him. Fix it. Make the problem go away. Instead, he took a slow breath. I can't. Ethan didn't answer. I'll drive you to work until it's fixed if you need. Still silence. I'll help you comparison shop repair shops. Nothing, but I won't pay for it. Another long pause. Then softly. I understand. They hung up. Art sat in his recliner, staring at the dark television screen for several minutes. It felt terrible, and strangely, it also felt right. Nearly 4 months after the hearing, Art was replacing a broken fence slat behind the house when he heard another vehicle pull into the driveway. Ethan stepped out, carrying a toolbox. Art hadn't asked him to come. He walked into the backyard. Still using that old hammer? It still works. Ethan nodded. So does this one. He held up his own hammer. For a few awkward seconds, neither of them moved. Finally, he said, I figured you could use another pair of hands. They spent nearly 3 hours replacing fence slats, mostly in silence, occasionally talking about measurements, the weather, football, nothing important, and yet everything important. When they finished, Art looked at the straight, new cedar line. Looks better, Ethan nodded. Yeah. He started to pack up his tools, then stopped. Dad, he said. Yeah? I went to see a counselor. Art looked at him. She asked me something last week. What? She asked why I kept calling your money our future. Ethan swallowed. I didn't know how to answer. Art waited. Finally, she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. What was it? She said, inheritance is a gift, not a retirement plan. Both of them were silent for a long moment. Then Ethan dropped his head. Honestly, I had convinced myself I was protecting Mom's legacy. Art gently shook his head. Your mother never called it her money. He frowned. She always called it our money. Art stepped closer. And after she was gone, it became the life you kept building. Ethan's eyes welled up. I'm sorry. This time there were no excuses. No blaming Lila. No blaming fear. Just 2 simple words. Art believed him. Would it erase what had happened? No. Trust didn't return overnight. But for the first time in months, Art saw his son instead of the man who had sat across from him at the dinner table that night. Art walked towards the house. Are you hungry? He looked surprised. I have some leftover beef stew. A slow smile spread across his face. I haven't had Mom's stew in years, I know. Inside, Art warmed 2 bowls while fresh bread toasted in the oven. They didn't talk about court, or guardianship, or money. Not that afternoon. Some conversations needed more than one meal. Some wounds healed one quiet Saturday at a time. Looking back now, Art didn't think the biggest lesson was about money. It was about boundaries. For years, Art had believed that loving his son meant rescuing him every time life got tough. Finally, at 62, he realized that true love sometimes meant stepping back, speaking the truth, and allowing another adult to carry their own choices. Eleanor often said that their marriage didn't begin on their wedding day. It began the day Art stopped apologizing for wanting a life of his own. If you've ever struggled to balance love with healthy boundaries, Art hoped you knew you weren't alone. Sometimes, protecting your own peace was the kindest thing you could do for everyone, even if it didn't feel like it at first.